Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Game Limited video we're going to be discussing yet more Intel i7-7700K benchmarks and overclocking results, including some frankly insane temperatures that the chip is getting to when it's not even reaching 5 GHz. Now, this information largely comes to us from an individual on Facebook. Now, it's his personal Facebook, so I don't want to give out his name for privacy reasons, because it's not like he is on a forum by the name of, Gobbledygook Chicken 55 or something like that. It's his personal Facebook, so that seems a bit unfair for me to give his name. But anyway, he does work for Lenovo, and so obviously he does have access to certain technology. Now, just to get us all onto the same page, Kaby Lake is, of course, an evolved Skylake architecture. It's basically using an optimized 14nm node. So what Intel have done is basically squeeze higher clocks out of the chip, while, at least in theory, the TDP of the processor should actually be lower. By the way, I forgot to mention this is also an article, so you can check that out if you so desire in the video description. Now, as one can imagine, because the architecture is fairly unchanged, IPC between Skylake and Kaby Lake are pretty much identical. Or, to put it into another way, if you have an application, a benchmark running on the 6700K and you were to do a blind test on the 7700K and you were to run them at the same clock speed, you would not most likely be able to tell the difference in performance. Now, the reason I say that, most likely, is there are a couple of subtle differences, largely down to the base clock and the boost clock of the CPU or turbo clock, and they are 4.2 or 4.5 GHz respectively, but everything else remains the same. For example, 8 MB of level 3 cache and the 4 cores and hyperthreading. Okay, I'm pretty sure most of you knew that, but it's good that we establish it. So an individual has managed to get, well, a couple of individuals actually have gotten hold of the i7-7700Ks already. One of the tests was ran on a Z170 platform. Just for your FYI, Kaby Lake is 100% backwardly compatible with 100 series Intel boards, but you do need to run a BIOS update first, and obviously that is down to the vendor/manufacturer to provide those BIOS updates. The board in question is an MSI Z170A Gaming Pro Carbon, which is a very solid board, a Deep Cool Frost Tower Extreme, which is obviously the CPU cooler, a Galaxy Hall of Fame DDR4 memory clocked at a ridiculous 4133 MHz, and finally the GTX 1070, also from MSI. It is the Duke edition. Now, let's talk about the performance at stock. So the i7 did score 377,544 in a Chinese benchmark, which is pretty famous. I can't remember the name of it offhand, to be honest with you, but it's pretty infamous in the Chinese circles of computer testing. In Fritz, which is a chess benchmark, the processor scored 17,049, and the most popular current benchmark probably for testing CPUs, Cinebench R15, in CPU testing they scored 913, and with default RAM speeds, which is only 2,133 MHz in Ada64, the CPU managed to hit 30,188 MB read, 31,137 MB write, and finally 27,000 MB copy. But overclocking did do better. So obviously there were a few changes. The first is that with the default clock speeds, the 7700K maintained a temperature around 66 degrees, which is actually kind of toasty when you think about it. It's not like it's a crappy cooler the individual was using. But during overclocking, and we'll certainly go more into the temperatures in a moment, the overall heat the CPU put out was quite substantial. So if you are more of an eager overclocking enthusiast, I would suggest at least a very high-end air cooler, preferably an AIO, or even better, a proper water cooling loop. Anyway, they used the same settings, the same hardware. The difference is they ran the RAM at 4133 and the chip was ran at 5 GHz. So Cinebench ran from 913 to 1089, Fritz 19,881, which is pretty impressive considering the default was 17,000-ish, and one can make a very compelling argument that a lot of that is down to the extra memory bandwidth. What I would like to have seen is the same tests conducted at the same clock speeds but with the same memory bandwidth. So in other words, the default clocks with the extra memory bandwidth would have made for quite an interesting tale. But there is more to it. So this is perhaps the crux of the matter and shows that Kaby Lake may not all be golden samples of joy. Take that one how you will. One of the samples hit, and this is a retail sample from what I can tell, hit just 4.9 gigahertz, running at 1.29 volts, which isn't awful in and of itself. The bad news, however, is that during Prime 95 it was very stable, which is obviously a good thing. The somewhat less good thing is it hit 100 degrees, which is kind of warm. So this leads me to a few conclusions. I'm not super impressed with Kaby Lake, to be honest. I mean, I would have liked it if there'd have been like a 5 or 10% IPC improvement. As it is, most of the improvements come down from the platform itself, which is of course is the 200 series boards. I won't go through all of them, you can see them on screen, but things such as you've got more maximum high speed HSIO lanes. There's an improvement there. You've got an additional 4. That also lends itself to the same number of additional PCIe 3.0 lanes. And of course, perhaps for some folks, the most important of all is the Intel Optane technology. Now, how many individuals are going to really use Optane technology and most of the other stuff I said is really down to you and your imagination and of course your setup. I would imagine for most folks, Optane may be better for processors which have high number of threads, especially if you're doing a lot of VM work or whatever. Then I could imagine how that would be useful, but you know, I guess that's down to your imagination really. Now do remember that perhaps two things are scuppering the Kaby Lake processors. One is Skylake. It's very hard for me to suggest that the person who is running, let's say, a 6700K upgrades to the 7700K. One can make a compelling argument that if you've got a Z170 based board, you do an upgrade for the BIOS, and your board supported, of course, with that BIOS update, and you're looking to get an i7-7700K, that's a pretty compelling argument. The other problem is Zen, and I won't go through all the Zen rumours because they're too numerous, but basically it's looking like Zen is going to offer a similar price point but with essentially more cores and more threads, and to kick you in the kneecap even harder, the IPC, or rather, I'm sorry, the single thread performance is looking very comparable to Skylake. So, assuming roughly the same clock speeds, it's very hard to argue that Kaby Lake is a good purchase. But that isn't to say that all of the Kaby Lake CPUs are bad or anything like that. It is, of course, going to be horses for courses, and I imagine in some applications Kaby Lake is going to be a better processor, perhaps in Skylake, perhaps in Zen, in, let's say, single thread performance or whatever. Perhaps the most impressive chip and the most impressive product, however, out of the Kaby Lake lineup for me so far is the i3-7350K. Now, we discussed this a couple of days ago, but basically it's an unlocked i3 processor, which, just to clarify, it's the first time that an i3 has ever been multiplayer unlocked. Now, yes, it is only 2 cores with hyper-threading, which isn't greatly impressive, but as I said in the article, the fact that it actually keeps up with older generation i7s, including but not limited to the 4770K, and obviously it will trounce if you've got an older i5, it absolutely demolishes it. It basically is making up for lack of cores with pure clock speed. Obviously in multi-threading tasks it possibly will start falling behind, But for cheap gaming rigs, assuming you can get a decent board at a comparable price, it's even more so if you're going with a small form factor build, it might be a great little purchase. So I'm not once again saying that the Kaby Lake CPUs are just useless or anything like that, but I think, just judging from a lot of comments from a lot of you all, Kaby Lake isn't really bringing in as much excitement as perhaps Intel would like, and that is naturally why we're going to see slowly the introduction of Coffee Lake in 2018/very late 2017, which naturally brings up the core count from the 4 to the 6, which I wish Intel would have done earlier. The reason supposedly they've not done that is because of yields and nodes and various other bits and pieces. Plus as well, to be honest, I think they've been really focused on reducing the power consumption, but obviously that's kind of kicking them in the shin. And one can argue, yeah, the desktop isn't perhaps as profitable as it was, but it is still profitable, especially in gaming and high-end enthusiasts, like the amount of audio files, people who do a lot of audio editing, video editing, programming, development, gaming. They still require an awful lot of CPU power. So I guess we're just going to have to see what all happens. Anyway, 100 degrees is kind of toasty for the 7700K, and obviously Silicon Lottery does indeed play a role. Just what I mean by that is, of course, that you could buy a 7700K, your friend Bob could buy a 7700K, and your friend Anne could buy a 7700K, and each of you could get very different results in terms of heat, power consumption, and also stability at various clock speeds. So, you know, I guess all we can do is wait. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I've also raised the volume a little bit compared to normal, so let me know if this is better, because a couple of you have previously told me that my voice was too loud, and then a couple of people have now messaged me and told me my voice is too quiet. So basically I'm going back to the older settings, and I guess it's better to be too loud than too quiet. Maybe? I don't know. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.